Welcome to Velvet Murmurs, where every whisper hides a secret. I am so glad you joined us for today's mystery. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are tuning in from. We love hearing from mystery lover from all over the world. Hercule Poirot and the Sins of St. Augustine's. Chapter 1. The Girl in the White Coat. The morning fog still clung to the garden of St. Augustine's Hospital, softening the stone facade and turning the windows to squares of dim silver. Inside, the corridors were narrow and echoing, the kind of passages where every footstep lingered too long. Nurses hurried quietly, their white shoes whispering against the tiled floor. Somewhere far off, a bell rang for morning rounds. In the hospital's west wing, the oldest part of the building, stood the seminar hall, a high-ceilinged chamber that smelled faintly of chalk, disinfectant, and sleeplessness. The room was used for lectures, case discussions, and for the weary resident doctors, the occasional nap on the hard benches. It was there, in that solemn hall, that Miss Eliza Marsh was found. She lay half-curled near the dais, still in her white coat, her hair dishevelled and one shoe missing. The pale sunlight, filtered through the frosted windows, caught the broken lenses of her spectacles on the floor. To an untrained eye, it looked like exhaustion had claimed her, one of those tragic collapses young doctors sometimes suffered after days of relentless work. The hospital matron, Mrs. Beatrice Hollow, had been the first to find her. Her sharp cry had drawn the attention of a porter, and within half an hour the seminar hall was filled with whispers and hurried footsteps. "Poor girl," someone murmured. "She'd been on duty 36 hours straight." "Heart failure," they said, or perhaps she took something. By the time Inspector Harold Sharp of the Brightsea police arrived, the gossip had already decided its verdict: suicide. But standing a little apart from the commotion, polishing his moustache with a handkerchief as if deep in thought, was a small, immaculately dressed man with patent leather shoes and an expression of quiet calculation: Hercule Poirot. He had come to St. Augustine's only the previous evening to deliver a lecture on the psychology of the criminal mind to the medical faculty. Now fate, or as he would later call it, the curiosity of the little grey cells, had placed him at the heart of a tragedy before breakfast. Poirot's keen eyes moved slowly over the scene. Nothing escaped him, not the smudge of dust on Eliza's right sleeve, not the small bruise on the underside of her wrist, nor the peculiar placement of her spectacles. He bent carefully, studying the floor where the light struck glass. "Ah," he murmured softly, "a left-handed fall, but a right-handed bruise." Inspector Sharp, a tall man with a tired patience, turned toward him. "You think there's something strange about it, sir?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he clasped his hands behind his back and walked in a slow circle around the body. "Tell me, mon cher inspecteur, how do the English say, 'she gave up hope', yes?" "She was overworked, exhausted, perhaps even despondent?" "That's what the matron and her colleagues claim," Sharp replied. "A bright girl, they said, but too proud to admit when she was struggling." Poirot nodded. "And yet, there is pride, yes, but there is also fight. Look at her hands, Inspector. The nails are broken, the skin grazed. This is not a woman who gave up. This is a woman who resisted." The matron flinched audibly. "Are you suggesting—" Poirot raised a delicate hand. "I suggest nothing, madam. I only observe. You see, the truth, she is like the body. She must be examined with care." The rest of the hall revealed its secrets in whispers. A tray of half-eaten sandwiches rested on a nearby desk, beside an open anatomy textbook and a notebook filled with Eliza's handwriting. Neat, firm, full of hope. A page lay marked with a ribbon. In elegant ink she had written, "One day I shall earn the gold medal, St. Mary's next year, perhaps. I must not fail." Poirot lingered over the words, his expression thoughtful. "A woman who writes such things does not plan her death, Inspector," he said quietly. "She plans her future." Sharp sighed. "And yet the evidence suggests no one entered or left this room after midnight. The porter swears by it. The doors were locked from inside when she was found." "Ah," Poirot's eyes brightened. "A locked room, you say? How very obliging of fate. She sends me puzzles wrapped in locks like little presents." He began to move toward the window, a narrow sash set high above the desks. It was closed, but unlatched. Poirot brushed a gloved finger along the sill. "Dust disturbed, but see here, a faint trace of oil. Someone opened it recently, perhaps to leave or to watch." By mid-morning, the hospital's principal, Dr. Lionel Gosforth, arrived, tall, composed, and impeccably dressed, though a hint of unease flickered beneath his professional calm. "My dear Inspector," he began, "this is a most regrettable matter. Miss Marsh was one of our brightest residents. The hospital's reputation—" Poirot interrupted gently. "Ah, reputation, a thing so fragile, n'est-ce pas? Like a bubble. Beautiful until touched." Gosforth frowned. "Surely you're not implying foul play? Miss Marsh was under enormous strain. She'd been on call for nearly 2 days." Poirot smiled faintly. "Then it is a marvel, Doctor, that she had time to polish her shoes before dying. See, spotless. Even in despair she found time for order. A curious kind of disorder, this suicide." Gosforth's lips tightened. "I'm afraid, Monsieur Poirot, you are reading too much into small details." "To the contrary," Poirot replied softly. "It is in the small details that truth hides her face." Outside, in the hospital courtyard, the fog had thinned. Poirot stood beside Inspector Sharp, both watching the nurses cross the gravel paths in clusters. Their white uniforms fluttered faintly in the wind like restless ghosts. "Inspector," Poirot said at last, "you will find that everyone in this hospital has something to hide. Pride, ambition, perhaps worse. A hospital is like a human body, outwardly clean, but inside—" He tapped his temple. "Inside there are infections waiting to spread." Sharp nodded grimly. "And you think one of those infections killed Miss Marsh?" Poirot smiled with that small, knowing twinkle. "I think, mon ami, that the girl in the white coat died not of exhaustion, but of knowledge. She saw something she was not meant to see." The detective turned, his polished shoes clicking softly on the stones. The fog curled around him once more, and for a moment his silhouette looked almost spectral against the pale walls of St. Augustine's. "Come, Inspector," he said. "Let us examine her quarters, her friends, her schedule. If the young lady was silenced, it was because her eyes were open, and Hercule Poirot will see what she saw." That evening, as dusk settled over Brightsea, the lights of St. Augustine's glowed faintly against the mist. Inside, nurses whispered about the foreign detective with the shining moustache and the unnerving gaze, and in the seminar hall, now locked and sealed, the broken spectacles of Eliza Marsh still lay under the pale glow of a single lamp, mute witnesses to a crime that had yet to speak its name. Chapter 2. The orderly named Samuel. The following morning, the fog over Brightsea on Hollow had lifted, revealing a pale, washed-out sky. The gulls circled lazily above the hospital's roof, their cries echoing against the sea breeze that carried the faint scent of salt and antiseptic through the open windows. Inside St. Augustine's Hospital, the corridors were busier than ever, but quieter too. Whispers moved faster than footsteps here. By the time Hercule Poirot reached the East Wing, the hospital already hummed with half-truths and rumours. Some said Miss Eliza Marsh had collapsed from fatigue, others murmured of heartbreak, and a few whispered that something unnatural had happened in the night. But Poirot, neat and unhurried as ever, ignored the gossip. He walked with his cane held precisely at a 45-degree angle, pausing now and then to glance through doorways, as if the truth might be hiding behind a linen cart. Beside him, Inspector Harold Sharp carried a small notebook, his brow furrowed. "We've begun questioning the staff," he said. "Most of them describe Miss Marsh as a model student. Polite, diligent, serious, no enemies to speak of. But there's one man, an orderly, Samuel Raines, used to be a cook apparently. He's been here longer than most of the doctors. Poirot's moustache twitched. Ah, a man who serves and observes, yes? The cook becomes the orderly, a change of costume but not of character. What do we know of this Samuel Raines? Sharp flipped a page. He's 42, worked in the kitchens years ago, vanished for some time, and then reappeared as a hospital orderly through some political favour, it seems. Lives in a barrack room at the back of the hospital, technically meant for constables. Rumour is he's very well connected, knows how to make things happen around here. Make things happen, Poirot repeated softly. An English phrase most flexible, Inspector. It can mean to arrange a bed for a sick mother, or to silence a witness. Sharp stopped mid-step. You think he's involved? Poirot merely smiled. I think, mon ami, that every story begins with the wrong narrator. Let us hear this one from the lips of Monsieur Raines himself. By evening, Poirot requested to see Raines's barrack room. The door was unlocked, another sign of a man who feared no one. The room was small, with a single bed, a cracked mirror, and an oil lamp on a wooden crate that served as a table. On the wall hung 2 boxing medals, tarnished but carefully polished. Un homme violent, Poirot murmured. A man of fists, not thoughts. Sharp moved toward a cupboard. Let's see what he keeps close. Inside were bottles, whiskey mostly, and a small tin box filled with women's trinkets, a broken brooch, a ribbon, a locket containing a faded photograph of a woman with tired eyes. Poirot took the photo and studied it under the lamplight. His first wife, Sharp said, reading from a note. Left him years ago after a charge of assault, case dismissed, lack of evidence. Poirot placed the photograph back carefully. Evidence is never lacking, Inspector. It is only misplaced or ignored. On the bedside table lay a small, peculiar object, a wireless earpiece, the kind used by hospital porters for internal communication. Poirot picked it up delicately. Such a small thing, yet it speaks to me. I think perhaps it has more to tell us than Monsieur Raines would. As they stepped out into the cold evening air, Sharp lit his pipe and said, He's our man, Poirot. Everything points to him. Violent past, easy access, arrogance. The girl must have caught him doing something, perhaps stealing medicine or worse. He panicked and killed her. Poirot stopped under the flickering gaslight, his gaze distant. Perhaps. But the killing, it is not what troubles me. It is the after. You see, my friend, a killer who panics runs, but this man, he stayed. He slept in his room, calm as a child. No, there is something more. Either he is innocent, or he is certain no one will dare touch him. Sharp frowned. And you think someone's protecting him? Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. I think, mon ami, that St. Augustine's protects many devils under its holy name. One orderly cannot rot a whole hospital. There are others, men in white coats perhaps, whose hands are far dirtier than his. That night, long after the wards fell silent, Poirot sat in his guest chamber, a small lamp illuminating his orderly notes. On one page he had drawn 3 neat circles, each with a name written inside. Eliza Marsh, Samuel Raines, Dr. Lionel Gosforth. He connected them with fine pencil lines, forming a triangle. At the top he wrote in neat Belgian script, In a place devoted to healing, sin often dresses as service. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, carrying faint echoes from the sea. Somewhere in the darkness of St. Augustine's, footsteps sounded, slow, deliberate, and unhurried. Poirot closed his notebook. The killer walks still, he murmured, but soon he shall step into the light. Chapter 3. The Gentleman Principal. The next morning dawned sharp and cold over Brightsea-on-Hollow. The mist had retreated toward the sea, leaving the cobbled streets glistening with dew. The spire of St. Augustine's Hospital rose solemnly above the town, like a warning finger pointing toward heaven, or perhaps a plea for forgiveness. Inside, the day began with the usual hospital rhythm, the rattle of trolleys, the shuffle of shoes, the low hum of voices trying to sound ordinary, despite the whisper that hung in every ward, the girl in the white coat. But Hercule Poirot was not one for ordinary rhythms. He arrived in the principal's office at precisely 10 minutes to 9. Punctuality, as he often remarked, being the twin brother of order. The office of Dr. Lionel Gosforth, principal of St. Augustine's, was everything one might expect of a man who valued image over truth. Mahogany panels lined the walls, portraits of benefactors gazed sternly down, and the faint aroma of expensive tobacco mingled with the sweet rot of old books. Dr. Gosforth himself stood behind a vast oak desk, immaculately dressed in a grey three-piece suit with a burgundy tie-pin. His hair was silver at the temples, his manner polished to the point of charm. He greeted Poirot and Inspector Sharp with the practised warmth of a politician who had shaken too many hands and remembered none. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot? The name needs no introduction. I only wish your visit were under happier circumstances." Poirot bowed slightly. "Alas, doctor, happiness is not what brings me to hospitals. Only pain, and occasionally the curious." Gosforth smiled thinly and gestured toward the armchairs before his desk. "Please, sit. I've already given my full statement to Inspector Sharp. A most tragic business, this. Miss Marsh was one of our brightest young residents. We are all quite shaken." Poirot lowered himself gracefully into a chair, adjusting his cuffs. "You knew her well?" "I made it my duty to know all my students," Gosforth replied, "especially those with promise. Miss Marsh was a dedicated worker, though rather high-strung. She often pushed herself beyond her strength." "Ambitious, then?" said Poirot softly. "Ambition, how very double-edged a thing it is. It builds the bridge to success, yet also to ruin." Gosforth's expression did not falter. "Medicine requires ambition, Monsieur Poirot. It is not a profession for the faint of heart, nor, it seems, for the faint of conscience," Poirot murmured. The remark hung in the air like smoke. Sharp shifted uneasily. Gosforth's smile hardened. "I beg your pardon?" Poirot looked up mildly. "Forgive me, doctor, I am a foreigner. My tongue, she runs away from me when my little grey cells are excited. You will, I hope, indulge my curiosity?" "Of course," Gosforth said tightly. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his eyes bright and watchful. "The night Miss Marsh died, where were you?" "In my residence on the hospital grounds," Gosforth replied smoothly. "I retired early. I was due in London the next day for a committee meeting." "And yet," Poirot said gently, "the porter who guards the main gate insists your car left the grounds shortly before midnight and returned at 1:30. There was a pause, brief but telling. Gosforth recovered quickly. "I had forgotten. Yes, I drove to the nearby pharmacy to collect a special prescription. My wife suffers from nervous insomnia." Poirot smiled faintly. "How thoughtful you are, doctor, and how fortunate, too, that the pharmacist remembers no such visit." This time Gosforth's jaw tightened. "Are you accusing me of something, Monsieur Poirot?" Poirot spread his hands. "Accuse? Never. I only observe contradictions. They are like little bruises upon the truth. Press them gently, and sometimes they tell you where it hurts." After the meeting, Poirot and Sharp stepped into the corridor. The inspector looked uneasy. "You're playing a dangerous game, Poirot. The man's well connected. He's got half the ministry behind him." Poirot adjusted his hat. "Ah, but does he have the truth behind him?" "Non, mon ami. You see, I have learned something this morning. Dr. Gosforth is not a liar by habit. He is a liar by necessity. He hides not from guilt of the act, perhaps, but guilt of the system. There is rot here, and he knows it." They walked past the hospital's grand staircase. where marble angels watched in silent disapproval. On the landing, a young nurse hurried past with a bundle of papers, nearly colliding with Poirot. "Pardon, sir," she gasped. Poirot smiled kindly. "No harm, mademoiselle, only curiosity. Tell me, you work here long?" "2 years, sir," she said, glancing nervously around. "I shouldn't be talking—" "They said to keep quiet." "About what?" Poirot asked gently. Her lips trembled. "About the body waste contracts, sir? The principal signed papers for medical disposals that never happened. We saw carts leave at night, filled with syringes and masks, not to incinerators, but to the docks." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Ah, so even the rubbish of St. Augustine's finds its way to profit." She swallowed. "People who asked questions were transferred. Mr. Akhtar, the old superintendent, tried to complain. They sent him to a smaller clinic in Dorset. He said one day it would lead to something dreadful." The detective bowed. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful. Courage, the truth, she always needs brave messengers." That evening, Poirot dined alone in his small guest chamber, overlooking the hospital courtyard. Outside, the lamps cast long, uneasy shadows on the cobblestones. He ate with the delicate precision of a man dissecting not food, but thought. He took out his notebook and drew another circle. Dr. Lionel Gosforth. Underneath, he wrote a single word. Fear. "Fear of exposure," he murmured. "Fear of scandal, and fear, my dear Hastings, is a most excellent motive for silence." He imagined Hastings' voice in his mind. "But surely, Poirot, a man of medicine wouldn't kill for reputation." Poirot smiled sadly to the empty room. "Mon ami, you forget. Reputation is the lifeblood of certain men. Take it away, and they bleed pride instead of blood." Later that night, Poirot wandered the darkened hospital corridors, his cane tapping softly on the tiled floor. A nurse passing by nodded respectfully. A porter avoided his gaze. The air was heavy with the smell of disinfectant and secrets. Near the east stairwell, Poirot paused. A faint sound echoed from behind the storage door. A clatter, then a voice. He opened it gently. Inside stood Samuel Raines, half hidden by shelves of supplies, speaking in low tones to another man, Dr. Gosforth's assistant, Mr. Henry Vale. "Well, I've done what you asked," Raines was saying. "But if you think I'll keep my mouth shut forever, you're mistaken. I want more than promises." "Quiet, you fool," hissed Vale. "You'll ruin us both." Poirot stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Ah, gentlemen, I fear I intrude?" Both men froze. Raines's face turned a shade paler. Vale stammered, "Monsieur Poirot, we were only—" "Discussing inventory, no doubt," Poirot finished smoothly. "How admirable that the hospital's staff are so diligent after hours." Raines muttered something under his breath and pushed past him. Vale followed quickly, the door swinging shut behind them. Poirot stood there for a long moment, looking at the dust motes swirling in the lamplight. Then he smiled faintly. "It is as I thought. A gentleman principal, with very ungentleman friends." At midnight, Poirot returned to his room. He stood by the window looking out toward the sea, where the lighthouse blinked its steady, sorrowful light. "The girl in the white coat," he whispered. "She saw it, did she not? The false contracts, the payments, the nocturnal dealings. She confronted one of them, perhaps Raines, perhaps Gosforth himself. And for that, she paid." He turned away from the glass, extinguished the lamp, and sat down at his desk. "Tomorrow," he murmured, "we begin to peel the onion, layer by layer. And if my little grey cells do not deceive me, what lies at the heart of St. Augustine's is something most foul indeed." Chapter 4. Secrets Beneath the Wards. The following day dawned without sunlight. The sky over Brightsea on Hollow was a slate-grey canopy, pressing low upon the rooftops as if the heavens themselves were brooding. At St. Augustine's Hospital, the corridors hummed with restrained tension. A storm of gossip brewed beneath the polished calm. Rumours of investigations, whispers of resignations, and the shadow of Miss Eliza Marsh's death still stretching across every ward like a lingering illness no one dared name. In a quiet corner of the hospital's administrative wing, Hercule Poirot stood before a locked iron door. The faint smell of damp paper seeped through the crack. Above the handle, a brass plate read, "Archives and Storage, Authorized Personnel Only." Poirot adjusted his bow tie and turned to Inspector Harold Sharp, who carried a ring of keys obtained, with some reluctance, from the hospital superintendent. "My dear Inspector," Poirot murmured, "have you noticed in England that the doors which proclaim authorized personnel only are always the ones behind which the unauthorized find the truth?" Sharp gave a faint smile and unlocked the door. "Let's see what truth smells like today." The hinges creaked in protest. Inside, the archive room was a vault of shadows, narrow aisles of tall shelving that leaned inward, heavy with folders and ledgers. Dust motes floated in the thin shaft of light that slipped through a high window. Poirot stepped forward delicately, his shoes clicking on the stone floor. "Ah, the smell of paper and mildew, how it delights me! It is the scent of human error preserved." Sharp chuckled softly. "You have a strange idea of pleasure, Poirot." "Mais non, mon ami. Pleasure is in the discovery, not in the comfort." They began to examine the shelves. Files labelled Patient Admissions, 1933-1935, Staff Payroll, and Medical Equipment Orders sat in neat disarray. Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the spines with the methodical rhythm of a clock. Then, near the back, something caught his attention. A row of identical folders, each marked with the same neat handwriting, Special Welfare Admissions. Poirot pulled one out. Inside were dozens of sheets, handwritten notes, signatures, and invoices, all stamped with the initials LG. "Dr. Lionel Gosforth," Poirot said softly. "The gentleman principal leaves his fingerprints not upon bodies but upon bureaucracy." Sharp leaned over his shoulder. "What are these?" "The names don't match any patients from our regular records." Poirot's finger traced a line down the page. "Because, my friend, they were not patients, they were transactions. Beds assigned to people who never existed, payments received, and funds quietly moved from one account to another." "Embezzlement?" Sharp whispered. Poirot shook his head. "Something subtler. Look here. Admission for patient, Mrs. Florence Hill, 24, severe infection. Admitted 4th April, discharged 5th April, fee collected. Yet there is no treatment record, no physician's notes, no follow-up entry. The patient, she existed only upon paper." Sharp frowned. "Then what's the purpose?" "To clean money, perhaps," Poirot said, "or to cover what should not be recorded at all." He replaced the folder carefully and turned toward the back wall. There, half hidden behind a curtain of cobwebs, was another door. Wooden, narrow, without a label. Poirot's eyes brightened. "Ah, a door behind a door. The English love their secrets." Sharp found the key that fit. The lock resisted for a moment, then yielded with a dull click. They stepped into a smaller chamber, colder and darker than the rest. The air was heavy with chemicals and faintly metallic. Shelves here were not filled with papers, but with jars, hundreds of them, lined like silent sentinels, each containing preserved tissue samples floating in amber fluid. Sharp grimaced. "Good Lord. Pathology specimens?" Poirot nodded slowly. "Or trophies, perhaps?" At the centre of the room stood a large steel cabinet with a broken handle. Poirot bent to inspect it, his reflection warped in the dull metal. "You will note, Inspector, the dust on the shelves, thick everywhere, except here. This cabinet is opened often." Sharp pried it open. Inside lay a ledger, thicker than the rest, and beside it a small box wrapped in brown paper. The detective's fingers brushed the lid. The smell of antiseptic grew sharper. He unwrapped the parcel. Inside lay a blood-stained white coat, folded neatly. A name tag still pinned. To the breast pocket read, Miss Eliza Marsh. Sharp exhaled sharply. That shouldn't be here. It should have been sealed in evidence. Poirot's gaze hardened. Ah, you see, evidence does not disappear by accident, Inspector. It is relocated. Someone within this hospital wished to keep her close, but out of sight. He examined the coat carefully. A torn sleeve at the right elbow, a faint smell of whiskey, not disinfectant. And this, he pointed to a small burn mark near the hem. A cigarette was dropped. The killer smokes, yes. But our orderly, Samuel Raines, smokes cheap tobacco. This, however, is Turkish blend, expensive. More befitting a gentleman of administration than a man of corridors. Sharp's eyes widened. You mean Gosforth? Poirot's expression remained unreadable. I mean perhaps that our doctor has more than one vice. They left the archives and ascended toward the main ward. The transition from shadows to brightness was blinding. Nurses bustling, the smell of breakfast, the illusion of normality, but Poirot's mind was elsewhere. As they passed a row of patient beds, a frail man with sharp eyes reached out and grasped Poirot's sleeve. "Are you the one asking questions?" he rasped. Poirot paused. "That depends, monsieur. Are you the one with answers?" The man's gaze flickered nervously toward a nurse. "They'll hear. They always hear." Sharp crouched beside him. "It's all right, sir. You can speak freely." The patient swallowed hard. "She came here. The girl. The one who died. She came to my ward the day before it happened. Asked for records. Said something about night admissions. Told me not to talk to anyone. She looked frightened. Then the next morning..." His voice broke. He turned away. Poirot laid a gentle hand on the man's arm. "Merci, mon ami. You have done well. Rest now." As they walked away, Poirot spoke softly. "Night admission with unrecorded patients. Stolen waste? Stolen lives, perhaps. Tell me, Inspector, when a hospital begins to heal its pockets instead of its people, what kind of disease is that?" "Corruption," Sharp muttered. "And it's spreading." "Just so," Poirot replied. "And Miss Marsh, she discovered the symptoms. But instead of curing the disease, she became its casualty." That evening, Poirot sat in the hospital chapel. The flicker of candlelight softened the severity of the stone walls. He gazed at the crucifix, the figure of Christ suspended in eternal suffering, and spoke quietly, as though to himself. She was a good girl, ambitious, proud, but goodness in a corrupt place is like a lantern in fog. It attracts the moths before it guides the lost. He folded his hands and lowered his head. And now the moths have begun to burn. Outside, in the darkening courtyard, the orderly Samuel Raines walked briskly toward the gatehouse. Poirot watched him from the chapel window, his silhouette small and purposeful against the mist. A second figure followed at a distance, tall, elegant, unmistakably Dr. Lionel Gosforth. Poirot smiled faintly, the candlelight glinting off his moustache. "Ah, my dear sinners of St. Augustine's," he whispered. "You walk together, but not for long." Chapter 5. The Woman from Hollow Lane. The rain began at dusk, falling softly upon the cobbled streets of Brightsea on Hollow, veiling the lamps in a silvery mist. The lights of St. Augustine's Hospital glowed faintly through the drizzle, the kind of lonely glow that belonged to places of secrets rather than salvation. Inside, Hercule Poirot sat by a window in the staff parlour, a teacup untouched before him. His gaze was fixed not on the rain, but upon his reflection in the glass. Behind that reflection the truth waited, and truth, as Poirot well knew, rarely knocked politely. The door opened quietly. Inspector Sharp entered, raincoat damp, expression grim. "There's a woman who wants to see you, Poirot. Says she's a nurse, but she's not on staff. Found her waiting by the east gate. Said she wouldn't speak to anyone else." Poirot rose immediately. "Ah, then she is either a witness or a ghost. Lead me to her, mon ami." They found her in the corridor outside the ward, a thin young woman in a sodden shawl, her eyes wide and wary. She looked around nervously before speaking. "My name's Clara Hensley," she whispered. "I used to work here. 2 years ago, before they made me leave." Sharp frowned. "On whose orders?" "Dr. Gosforth's," she replied, her voice trembling. "He said I was spreading rumours, but they weren't rumours. They were real." Poirot's voice softened. "Come, mademoiselle, you shall sit, and you shall tell me everything, from the beginning." They guided her to a small waiting room, lit by a single gas lamp. The ticking of a wall clock filled the silence between words. "It started when I was on night duty," Clara began, clutching the edges of her shawl. "Every Friday about midnight, a carriage or ambulance would arrive through the side gate, the one near Hollow Lane. We were told never to go near it. They'd bring in women, unconscious, sometimes barely alive, and take them straight to the lower wing." "The lower wing?" Sharp interrupted. "That section's been closed for years." Clara shook her head. "Not closed. Hidden. Dr. Gosforth said it was used for private medical research." "But those women weren't patients, Inspector. They were strangers. Poor women from the nearby districts, the kind who wouldn't be missed. I saw one once. She had the mark of a ring on her finger, but no ring. She whispered something before they took her away." Poirot leaned forward. "What did she say?" Clara's eyes glistened. "She said, 'Tell Eliza.'" Poirot's hands stilled. "Eliza Marsh?" Clara nodded. "Yes, Miss Marsh found out. She came to me, asked questions, asked for names. I begged her to stop, told her it was dangerous, but she said, 'If I don't, no one will.' A week later, she was dead." The clock ticked louder in the silence that followed. Sharp's voice was low. "Why didn't you go to the police?" Clara gave a short, bitter laugh. "Go to the police? Inspector, the same men who escorted those women into the hospital wore police badges on their coats." Poirot closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with renewed fire. "You are very brave, Mademoiselle Hensley, and now I think we must find this lower wing." Shortly after midnight, Poirot and Sharp, accompanied by Clara, descended into the hospital's underbelly. The air grew colder, the walls damp with salt and neglect. Their lanterns cast long, trembling shadows. They passed a row of disused operating rooms, dust-coated, reeking faintly of old ether. Finally, they reached a heavy door marked Sub-Level B, restricted. "It's here," Clara whispered. "They used to lock it after every visit." Sharp examined the lock. It was new, recently fitted. He took out a small pry tool and, after a few moments of quiet effort, forced it open. The door swung inward with a groan. Inside lay a corridor dimly lit by a single flickering bulb. There were rooms on either side, small, windowless, each containing an old hospital bed, metal trays, and stained linen. But one door at the far end stood slightly ajar. Poirot motioned them to follow. The room was larger, lined with filing cabinets and a surgical table in the centre. Upon it lay a cracked porcelain basin filled with something dark and sticky. The smell was sharp, chemical, and unmistakable. Sharp gagged softly. "What in God's name?" Poirot, calm as ever, examined the basin with his gloved hands. "Blood, Inspector, not fresh, but not long abandoned either." He turned to the cabinets. "And here we have the records, the true records, not the ones above." He opened the first drawer. It was filled with files labelled only by numbers, no names, no birth dates, no history. Each bore the signature. L.G. Poirot murmured, "Dr. Lionel Gosforth again, a man who writes his guilt as neatly as his prescriptions." Clara's voice shook. They said it was all for research, blood studies, tissue work, but I saw men bringing in sacks, heavy ones, and sometimes they'd leave lighter. Poirot paused, his face darkening. Mademoiselle, are you suggesting— I'm saying, she interrupted softly, that they used the hospital to sell body parts. Medical waste, human remains, anything valuable. Eliza found the accounts. She confronted someone. After that, she was marked. Sharp stared at her. And you think it was Gosforth? Clara looked down. No, it wasn't him who killed her. He gave the orders, but he never dirtied his hands. It was someone else, someone who worked close, who knew every corner of this place. Samuel Rain, Poirot said quietly. Clara nodded. He was always there when the carriages came. He took the money, kept the keys, but he wasn't alone. There was another man, one of the senior doctors. They called him the Keeper. Poirot frowned. The Keeper of what? Clara's voice trembled. Of secrets, Monsieur Poirot. Of bodies. When they returned upstairs, dawn was beginning to break over the hospital courtyard. The rain had stopped, leaving the windows streaked with silver. Poirot paused at the staircase and turned to Sharp. Do you see now, Inspector? This is no ordinary crime of passion. It is a system of corruption, a network, a web that stretches from the basement to the boardroom. Sharp rubbed his temples. Good God, Poirot, this goes beyond the hospital. We'll need higher clearance, maybe even the ministry. Poirot nodded gravely. Yes, but be careful whom you trust, mon ami, for here every man who carries a badge also carries a shadow. He turned to Clara. You must disappear for a time, mademoiselle. Leave Brightsea tonight. I will find you when the truth is safe. Clara hesitated. Will it ever be safe? Poirot looked out toward the pale horizon. For some, perhaps not, but for Eliza Marsh, it shall be avenged. Later that morning, as Poirot returned to his quarters, he noticed a letter slipped beneath his door. The envelope bore no seal, only his name written in an elegant, almost feminine hand. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper bearing one line. Some truths are better buried, Monsieur Poirot. Do not dig where angels fear to tread. At the bottom, a small crimson smudge, a fingerprint. Poirot stared at it for a long while, then smiled faintly. Ah, my dear anonymous friend, he murmured. But you see, it is precisely where angels fear to tread that Hercule Poirot begins to walk. Chapter 6. The night of the 4th of May. The evening of May the 4th had begun like any other at St. Augustine's Hospital, with exhaustion, the faint echo of wheeled trolleys, and the weary sighs of overworked doctors. But by the time the moon rose above Brightsea on Hollow, the air had shifted. There was a thickness to it, an unease that seemed to creep through every corridor, every flickering light. It was the night that would unmake them all. Hercule Poirot had by then pieced together the timeline with the precision of a watchmaker. He stood by the blackboard in the seminar room the morning after the fire, his neat handwriting marking the hours like a map of doom. Each time he tapped his pencil against a note, a faint echo of truth reverberated through the room. Mes amis, he had told Inspector Sharp, to understand the murder, we must understand the rhythm, the timing. A crime, you see, has a tempo, like a symphony. Miss Eliza Marsh's death played on the night of the 4th of May, and it is within those silent hours that we find the notes of guilt. Eliza Marsh had been awake for 34 hours by then. Her last shift had begun on the previous morning, an unbroken stretch of surgeries, admissions and emergencies that had blurred into one long march of fatigue. But Eliza had endured with quiet resilience, her colleagues would later say. A model student with an unshakable smile. She had last been seen in Ward 3B checking on a pneumonia case before heading toward the old seminar hall. There, on the 3rd floor, she planned to rest for an hour before the morning rounds. In her satchel she carried a small leather diary, its cover worn, its pages filled with hopes that had outgrown her modest surroundings. Poirot had held that diary later in his hands, reading her slanted, eager handwriting under the lamplight. "Some day I will earn the gold medal. Some day I shall work at St. Mary's Hospital in London. I will make father proud." Simple dreams, written with the fervour of someone who still believed goodness could protect her. The room where she lay was small, with wooden floorboards and a single brass reading lamp. The night watchman had seen the light burning faintly as he passed at 2:30. At that hour, Eliza had curled up on the mattress kept near the seminar podium, a red blanket draped over her shoulder, her spectacles set neatly beside her. Her last recorded action, a message to her cousin at 2:35 a.m., read only, "All well, another long night." By 3 o'clock she was asleep. It was then that Samuel Raines entered the hospital grounds. The security guard stationed by the main gate remembered him, staggering slightly, his breath heavy with liquor, his uniform dishevelled. He had claimed he was on welfare duty, showing his badge with drunken insistence. Poirot later found that badge discarded near the east stairwell. "A man who shows his credentials at the gate," he mused, "but hides his face in the hall. Such a man does not come to serve, but to destroy." Raines had been seen in the company of another civic volunteer earlier that evening, drinking in the derelict lot behind the hospital. But some time after midnight he had separated, muttering that he had business to settle. At 3:45 a.m. the hospital's security log recorded the gate opening. The CCTV, grainy and pale from the fog, caught him entering, alone. Around his neck hung a small metal device, a cheap listening gadget he often used to intercept wireless frequencies. "He fancied himself a detective," Sharp had said grimly, watching the footage. "Listened to private calls between staff, blackmailed them for favours." Poirot's eyes had narrowed. Oui, and perhaps on this night he intended to listen again, only this time to silence a voice forever. The clock's minute hand had barely ticked past 4 when Raines pushed open the door of the seminar room. The hinges creaked faintly, then the sound died, swallowed by the heavy curtains and insulated walls. Inside, the room was dark, save for the dim glow of the desk lamp. Eliza lay asleep, her breathing soft, the red blanket pooled around her. Raines stood there, motionless for several seconds. Perhaps he watched her, perhaps he hesitated. But something in him, fear, lust, or rage, finally moved. Poirot would later reconstruct this moment from evidence that spoke quietly, but precisely. The overturned chair near the desk. The broken spectacles found to the left of the body, though the bruise on her hand was on the right. A faint blood smear on the doorknob, as if someone had wiped it in haste. And beside her, the listening device, detached, cracked, still faintly blinking blue. Poirot believed that after leaving the hall, Raines did not flee immediately. Instead, he crossed to the barracks, a small, dimly lit room behind the old canteen, where he collapsed on his cot, still wearing his boots. The pillow there bore a faint smear of red, later confirmed to be Eliza's blood. He slept until dawn, perhaps believing the crime buried within the hospital's habitual chaos. But guilt has a curious way of whispering. And someone heard. At 6 o'clock, a junior doctor named Auroch Dempsey entered the seminar room to collect his notes. The scream that followed drew half the ward. Within minutes, the corridor filled with nurses and interns. Eliza's body lay on the floor, her face bruised, her spectacles shattered, her hands curled, as though still gripping something unseen. The principal, Dr. Gosforth, arrived 15 minutes later, his face pale, his voice tight with command. "No one enters," he ordered. "Secure the room. This will be handled discreetly." Discreetly. The word echoed later in every inquiry, every hushed conversation. The police were not summoned until hours later. The autopsy was done without an official report. and the one man who had entered that room between 3:45 and 4:42 a.m., Samuel Raines, was quietly left unmentioned in the records. Standing before the staff that afternoon, Poirot's voice carried neither anger nor pity, only the steady rhythm of logic. "Here is what happened," he said, tracing the timeline on the blackboard. At 2 a.m., Miss Marsh retires to the seminar hall, exhausted but content. At 3:45, Mr. Raines enters the hospital, drunk. At 4:03, he enters the hall. There is struggle. At 4:15, she dies. At 4:42, he departs. And by 5 hours, he sleeps. Voila, a crime of timing, of arrogance, of neglect. He stepped back, folding his hands behind his back. But note, Inspector, Raines remained within the hospital even after dawn. He did not flee. Why? Because he felt safe. Someone, you see, had assured him he would be protected. Someone in power. Sharp frowned. Gosforth? Perhaps, Poirot murmured. Or perhaps another, one who wears grief like a cloak. But that, my friend, is for tomorrow. The rain began again that evening, soft and rhythmic against the window panes. Poirot lingered alone in the seminar room, his reflection dim in the glass. The air still carried a faint scent of bleach and lilac, the perfume Eliza had worn. On the desk lay her diary, open to the last line she had written before sleep. "Some day I shall be someone they remember kindly." Poirot closed the diary gently. "Oui, mademoiselle," he whispered. "They will remember you, though not as you imagined." He turned off the lamp, leaving the room in darkness. Somewhere below, the chapel bell began to toll again. The slow, mournful toll of the 4th of May, still echoing across Brightsea, still waiting for its final confession. Chapter 7. The Riot in Brightsea. By the morning of May the 6th, the stillness that had once hung over Brightsea on Hollow was gone. The old seaside town, usually so quiet, with its cobbled lanes and the faint hum of gulls, now trembled with noise and fury. The news of Eliza Marsh's death had spread beyond the hospital's walls like a fever. Students gathered at the iron gates of St. Augustine's Medical College, their white coats fluttering in the sea wind like banners of rebellion. They carried hand-painted placards, "Justice for Eliza," "No more lies," "End the silence." Nurses stood beside them, their faces pale with grief and exhaustion, while the townsfolk watched from shop fronts and windows, whispering about corruption, cruelty, and the fall of a once-honoured institution. Inside the hospital, where corridors still reeked faintly of smoke and bleach, Hercule Poirot stood beside Inspector Sharp, observing the rising tide of chaos through the leaded glass of the superintendent's office. "Look at them," Sharp muttered, tugging at his collar. "We've got half the staff threatening to resign, students rioting, and the newspapers calling this the Brightsea scandal." Poirot's eyes were fixed on the crowd, his hands folded neatly behind his back. "It is the nature of truth, mon ami. She burns when she is first revealed." He turned from the window. "But tell me, have you found the missing autopsy file?" Sharp shook his head. "Gone. Vanished from the archives the same night as the fire. The copy in the police register's been replaced with a duplicate. Dates altered, cause of death marked as suicide. Whoever did it had access to both hospital and police records." Poirot gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Then we are not dealing with mere incompetence. We are dealing with collaboration. You see, my friend, murder is not always committed with a knife. Sometimes," he tapped a gloved finger against the air, "it is committed with a signature." By noon the first stones had been thrown. The crowd outside the hospital gates swelled to hundreds. Reporters from the Brightsea Chronicle scribbled furiously, their hats askew, while students chanted, "Gosforth out! Justice for Eliza!" The sound carried up through the hospital corridors like the beating of a war drum. Inside, Dr. Lionel Gosforth paced his office, his face grey, beneath the yellow lamplight. His once impeccable suit was rumpled, his voice raw from arguing with the board. "They're calling me a murderer, Poirot," he shouted when the detective entered. "A murderer. I gave my life to this institution." Poirot regarded him coolly. "And yet, Doctor, it appears the institution has been living rather well on yours." Gosforth froze. "What do you mean?" Poirot placed a stack of ledgers on the desk. "Accounts from your welfare cell. Funds marked for charity admissions. Transferred, it seems, to private accounts. You see here, the payments were authorized not only by you, but by two others." He pointed to the signatures: Samuel Raines, now dead, and Evelyn Marsh. The doctor's face drained of colour. "That's impossible. Mrs. Marsh was merely a former nurse. She had no authority here." Poirot smiled faintly. "No, but she had influence. The signatures, you see, they match perfectly. And the ink, according to my little experiment, is recent. Not from years past, but from the month of April." Sharp, who had been standing by the door, whistled low. "You're saying she forged it?" Poirot's tone softened. "No, Inspector. I am saying she participated, whether out of desperation or design, that we shall see." By late afternoon, Brightsea had turned into a powder keg. Marchers flooded the narrow streets, waving photographs of Eliza, her smiling graduation portrait, now a symbol of outrage. The Brightsea Gazette printed an extra edition, "Young Doctor Dead, Suicide or Cover-Up." Reports emerge of falsified autopsy, hospital corruption, and possible links to political donors. Citizens demand inquiry. From the town square to the sea cliffs, people whispered that the hospital's dead were being sold for research, that the fire was deliberate, that someone in London had ordered silence. Poirot, ever composed, made his way through the crowd with Sharp close behind, his grey hat gleaming faintly under the cloudy sky. He was recognized by a group of students who parted to let him pass. "Is it true, sir?" one young woman cried out. "Did they kill her for money?" Poirot paused, looking at the sea of anxious faces. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "the truth is never so simple, but justice. She will come, if you let reason, not anger, lead her." They fell silent, watching the small, dignified figure as he disappeared through the hospital's side gate. Inside, the scene was no less volatile. The wards were half deserted. Frightened patients had been moved to nearby facilities. The remaining nurses huddled together in anxious whispers. In the main hall, broken glass glittered on the tiles, and one of the old portraits had been torn from the wall. Poirot found himself once again in the seminar room, the place where Eliza Marsh had met her death. It was eerily still, the chaos outside muffled by thick walls. He studied the floor, the shadows, the small scorch mark near the desk. From his pocket, he drew out two envelopes, both retrieved from the principal's files. One contained the falsified autopsy, the other a letter written in elegant handwriting, addressed to the Ministry of Health, never sent. "If anything should happen to me," it read, "let it be known that corruption runs deeper than anyone imagines. The name Gosforth will not stand alone." The letter was signed Eliza Marsh. Poirot stood in silence for a long moment. "She knew," he murmured. "She intended to expose them. And someone, perhaps more than one, ensured she could not." That night, the protests turned violent. The crowd outside breached the hospital gates. Stones shattered the front windows and torches flared against the fog. The police, overwhelmed, formed a shaky line at the entrance. Someone set fire to the old storage wing. The flames licked upward, reflected in the wet pavement like veins of molten gold. Through it all, Poirot and Sharp remained within the main corridor, the detective's composure unbroken. "You're mad to stay in here," Sharp muttered. "The whole place could go up again." Poirot adjusted his tie. "Then let us solve the case quickly, mon ami." He nodded toward a door left ajar, the principal's private records room. Inside, files were scattered, drawers ransacked, but one folder lay undisturbed, marked Contracts, Anatomical Procurement. Poirot knelt, his eyes gleaming as he scanned the pages. "There," he whispered, Payments from a London research company, large sums transferred through a shell charity, the signatories. He traced them with a finger. Gosforth, Rains, Marsh. It is all one circle. The daughter learns the truth, the mother buries it, the servant kills to keep it buried, and the doctor profits from silence. A perfect chain of sin. Sharp frowned. But why would the mother? Because, Poirot interrupted softly, love and guilt are dangerous twins. Perhaps she began as whistleblower and ended as avenger. We must not yet judge. By midnight, the riot reached its peak. The streets around the hospital blazed with lamplight and shouting. The wind carried the smell of smoke and seaweed. Poirot and Sharp stepped outside, the noise washing over them like a living storm. A column of police pushed through the crowd, dragging away a group of masked agitators. One of them, a young man in a torn student coat, shouted, "They're lying to us! The doctor's killed her!" Poirot turned to Sharp. "Do you hear it? The cry of injustice, real or imagined. It is the echo of a society that no longer trusts its conscience." The inspector sighed. "And what do we do with that?" Poirot smiled faintly. "We answer it, not with guns, but with truth." The next morning, Brightsea lay in uneasy silence. The fires were out, the crowds dispersed, but the damage had been done. Broken windows, trampled flower beds, torn posters flapped in the cold wind. In the superintendent's office, Poirot stood over a map spread across the desk. Red pins marked the key points: the fire, the seminar room, the barracks, and the administration wing. Sharp entered, his uniform dusted with soot. 3 arrests, a dozen injuries. Gosforth's under guard in his office. Mrs. Marsh hasn't been seen since last night. Poirot's eyes lifted. "Ah, then the final act begins." He tapped the map. "You see, my friend, corruption is like rot beneath the floorboards. One must strip away the surface to find its source. The fire, the riot, the forged certificates, all distractions. The heart of this matter lies not in greed alone, but in grief." Sharp frowned. "You think the widow's involved?" Poirot gave a small, knowing smile. "I think, Inspector, that when one loses a child, the soul begins to invent its own justice." He placed his hat upon his head, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Come. It is time to meet the woman who set this all in motion." Chapter 8. The Final Diagnosis. The night's storm had passed, leaving Brightsea on Hollow shrouded in pale morning mist. From the windows of St. Augustine's Hospital, the town below looked ghostly, its rooftops glistening with dew, its streets still echoing faintly with the unrest of the night before. The hospital itself stood like an aging giant, weary and wounded, but not yet fallen. In the grand lecture hall, once a place of learning and applause, chairs had been arranged in a half-circle. The portraits of past deans, men who had once prided themselves on honour and discipline, seemed to watch the gathering with grim, painted eyes. The faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, a reminder of the chaos that had nearly consumed the institution. At the front of the room stood Hercule Poirot, immaculate as ever in his grey suit and polished shoes. His moustache was perfectly trimmed, his demeanour calm but grave. He had called for this meeting at dawn, the final act in a tragedy that had wound through lies, corruption, and quiet cruelty. Seated before him were the key figures: Dr. Lionel Gosforth, his once proud posture reduced to slumped shame; Samuel Rains, pale and trembling, his arm in a sling, under guard after his attempted flight; Nurse Margaret Doyle, eyes swollen from tears, clutching a rosary in trembling hands. And at the side table, Magistrate Henry Cavill, representing the Crown, his pen poised above a legal pad. The heavy door shut with a dull thud. Silence filled the room. Poirot began. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said softly, his accent weaving elegance into the cold air. "You have all played your parts in this sorrowful drama. It is time now, before the law and before God, that the truth should be laid bare, as one might lay bare the wound before it can heal." He turned to Rains first. Monsieur Raines, you have confessed to being in the seminar hall on the night of May the 4th. You have said you were drunk, that you went to see Miss Eliza Marsh regarding some personal misunderstanding. But that is not the truth, n'est-ce pas? Raines's voice was hoarse. I didn't mean to kill her. I swear to you I didn't. She started shouting, said she'd go to the papers, that she knew what was happening with the welfare funds. I tried to shut her up, just to make her stop screaming. Poirot inclined his head slightly. Yes, you tried to silence her. With your hands. Raines buried his face in them. It wasn't supposed to happen like that. She fell. She hit her head. Poirot's tone remained calm, but his eyes gleamed with sorrowful sharpness. Non, monsieur, she fought you. She tore the listening device from your neck. Her bruised hand tells me that. You stayed 37 minutes. Long enough not only to kill her, but to destroy what evidence she held. You took the diary, yes? But in your haste, you dropped the one thing that betrayed you. He pointed to the small black object on the table, the broken Bluetooth-like device. The listening device, still connected to your phone when the police tested it. Proof enough. Raines flinched, as though struck. The magistrate's pen scratched across paper. Continue, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot turned now to Dr. Gosforth. Doctor, you did not commit the act of murder, yet your hands are far from clean. Gosforth stiffened. You're twisting this. I had nothing to do with her death. But you had everything to do with her silence, Poirot replied. You built a system where silence was rewarded, and truth was punished. Miss Marsh discovered that your welfare cell was funneling money to ghost patients and that you used her signature to certify those files. You forged her compliance and paid Raines to ensure the matter disappeared. Is it not so? The doctor's voice cracked. I didn't pay him to kill her. Poirot's tone remained cool. No, you merely created the circumstances in which her death became convenient. For a long moment, the only sound in the hall was the ticking of the clock above the blackboard. Then Poirot continued, turning to Nurse Doyle. Mademoiselle Doyle, he said gently, you are the only one here who holds innocence in her heart. Yet you, too, kept silent. You saw the marks on Eliza's body. You saw the bruises, the way her clothes were arranged. You knew this was not suicide. Tears spilled down her cheeks. I tried to speak, Monsieur Poirot, I did, but the superintendent said it would ruin the hospital, that no one would believe me. I'm just a nurse. Poirot nodded gravely. And so you stayed quiet. Thus do the small silences build into great crimes. He paced slowly across the floor, his voice soft yet unyielding. In this case, murder came not from passion alone, but from negligence, from greed, from fear, from the rot that grows when men of healing become men of profit. He paused beside the window, where the pale sun had begun to break through the mist. Dust motes shimmered in the beam like drifting ash. You see, my friends, Poirot said, turning back, a hospital is meant to heal. Yet here it became a place of decay, moral and human. Miss Eliza Marsh, in her devotion, believed she could cleanse it, and so she became its sacrifice. He pointed toward the files spread on the table. Here is the evidence: falsified death certificates, fraudulent signatures, missing reports. Together they form the true anatomy of this crime. Samuel Raines may have been the hand, but the disease that moved him, that spread through this institution, belongs to all who looked away. Inspector Sharp stepped forward. Poirot, do you mean to say the entire administration was in on it? Poirot sighed. No, my friend, only enough of them to make truth dangerous. He looked at Gosforth again. When Miss Marsh uncovered your deception, you were not frightened for your soul, only for your reputation. You allowed a violent man to remain in your hospital because he was useful. You paid him to silence critics, to fetch favors, to protect your walls of secrecy. And when he murdered, you covered it with a report. A suicide. A single word that cost you nothing but buried a life. Gosforth bowed his head. You don't understand, Poirot. I was trying to keep the institution standing. If the scandal broke, hundreds of patients would lose their care. Poirot's eyes softened. And yet, Doctor, when one defends a lie in the name of duty, one only feeds corruption. The hospital may stand, but the soul collapses. The magistrate rose slowly. Then it is settled. Samuel Raines will stand trial for murder, Dr. Gosforth for corruption and obstruction of justice. Nurse Doyle will testify under protection, and the ministry shall open inquiry into every signature you mentioned, Monsieur Poirot. Poirot inclined his head. Justice, monsieur, must not only be done, it must be seen to be done. He turned, surveying the weary faces before him. But remember this, there is guilt that the law cannot punish. The guilt of silence, of indifference. It festers like infection, and it is this that Miss Marsh fought and died to expose.